So Stephanie, welcome.
Okay.
Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us. Stephanie is the founder of Source Transitions, and her doctoral research has focused on using AI in food sustainability. And she's going to be presenting her work in designing participatory processes for members of the public to work with policymakers in Australia.
Thank you very much. Do I share my screen? Is that how we do it? Yeah.
Yes, if you're able to, you
Yep.
should be able to share your slides yourself.
Here we go. Let me know if you can see them.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Lovely to be here. So let's get going directly. What happens when you invite the people most affected by AI systems to shape governance, not after the designs are locked in, but before? I'm Stephanie Camarena, and for the past 7 years, I've been asking the same question: how do we make communities the architect of their own AI-enabled futures? That question led to a PhD, to finding source transitions, to working with clients and IEEE, the OECD, or the UN on resolving that specific question. Today, I'll share what happened when we used a bottom-up approach at the AU Data workshop in Melbourne. 33 participants, senior experts, including community leaders, policymakers, professors, and students. We had 2 intense topics, one on AI and family violence, and the other one on youth futures and tech addiction. The question is, can structured participation deliver the depth that tokenistic consultation cannot? I put 2 frameworks here. They're 50 years apart, but they have the same diagnosis. Both the Austen's ladder from 1969 and the Delgado's participatory AI model from 2021 show that most governance gets stuck here in the purple zone: consultation, tokenism, communities who react to decisions that are already made. With AU Data, we aimed higher. We operated up here at the partnership level, or somewhere in between the collaborate and empower level on the Delgado model. The community providers who participated in the workshop didn't just give feedback, they actually co-designed the questions and they shaped the governance dialogue. So my question isn't whether it was possible to co-design and empower communities to a certain point in these important topics. We showed that we could do that, but the question is, how do we make it the norm? AU Data is the Australian section of IEEE's DITA program. That's Dignity, Inclusion, Identity, Trust, and Agency in Cyberspace. The AU Data workshop started in 2023. And in 2024, we had one specifically on AI and family violence, which led directly to the first IEEE Industry Connection project on that issue. In 2025, we brought community service providers into the governance conversation. Our core principle: speakers provoke, participants think, experts inform and challenge, but the real governance work is done by the participants themselves. Sorry, it takes a little bit of time for each slide to kind of load up. So here's the setup. We had 33 participants, 12 expert panelists, 3 working groups, and the mix mattered. We had policymakers, standards representatives, community service providers, researchers, and students all in the same room. All, including policymakers, arrived early and stayed the whole day, even though it was not their session anymore. 4 elements were designed to prevent the usual dilution. We had forced cross-pollination, so people don't cluster with just their colleagues. Think, pair, share was used so that the individual voice isn't lost. We used real-time synthesis so that the insights became questions immediately, and created a policy dialogue so the policymakers must respond, not just listen. So let me walk through each briefly. For forced cross-pollination, every participant gets some colored dots on their name tag. Each round, different color combinations pair together. The result is that we had a commissioner paired with a community worker from a family violence support service. A standards representative discusses youth tech addiction with an engineering student who's never been taught ethics. There was no comfortable clustering, genuine cross-pollination every round. This is how you get insight and conversation that no single stakeholder group would surface alone. The think, pair, share structure is crucial. Each session started with a provocation, a focused challenge. For example, in Youth Futures, we asked, picture a young person in 2035. What skills has AI replaced? What new skills do they need? What relationship with technology do you hope for them? Then the participants were invited to the think activity, where they took 5 to 10 minutes of individual reflection, silent reflection, to get their own response to the provocation. In the pair period, they had 10 to 15 minutes with their dot matched partner. They shared cards, they shared perspectives, and then they wrote one rule or one action together as a result of their conversation. Then we had a share activity where for 15-20 minutes, we had a group synthesis, again, using the color-coded dots on the cards. And the groups clustered similar ideas, voted, identified missing voices. The key was that individual voice was captured before the group dynamics took over. So the student who felt terrified to speak up, they've already written their thoughts, so that perspective doesn't get lost. After sessions 1 and 2, we synthesized everything in real time. From the family violence session, for example, they clustered rules on blue cards, what participants agreed AI system must do or never do. These weren't filed away. They were presented back to the room in a 10-minute workshop insights presentation, then handed directly to the policy and standards panel. The questions that emerged weren't soft. For example, they asked about the Safety Commission's under 16 social media ban that you might have heard of, started in Australia. And they ask questions such as, does requiring young people to provide biometric data to prove their age actually solve the problem, or does it give platforms even more personal data? The expert had to respond to these in real time. There was no hiding behind reports. The third session was the policy at the crossroads. It really brought the speakers and the participants together for a 25-minute discussion, responding to what the participants had surfaced. The commissioner, for example, didn't just observe, he responded very candidly. On regulation, he was direct. Most of the harms people see are already illegal, he said. AI just makes it easier, cheaper, more convincing for bad guys to do bad stuff. His argument was make laws tech neutral because technology will keep evolving, but the types of harm won't. This is the before the policy Hardens moment the title refers to. The workshop brought to the attention of policymakers and experts the type of questions and solutions raised by the community on the topics. Governance experts' thinking was actively forming. They were not reviewing a completed consultation. They were engaging with community perspectives while their own thinking was still in motion. That's fundamentally different from the typical pattern where communities are invited to comment on a draft that's already been through 3 rounds of internal reviews. Experts stayed beyond the schedule, voluntary. That was a bit more than just consultation. So what did the method surface? insight that would never emerge in a typical tech-led consultation. The Arne example here came from a community service provider. She explained, a technical team designing an AI intake system might use honor as a neutral word. But for families affected by honor-based violence, it's loaded. It can mean pride, or it can mean I'm in danger. So for example, when police force are using AI-assisted case management, they need to know that my family's concern about honor may signal imminent risk and not cultural values. That's knowledge that no algorithm team would surface on their own. The engineering student code emerged the same way. Paired with ethics researchers and community workers, the contrast became visible. In 3 years, I've never been taught anything about ethics. That's not an individual failing, it's a systemic gap. But it only surfaced because we put people in combination that don't normally happen. The family violence session asked participants to write one way AI could harm on a red card. That provocation, plus the safety of individual reflection before sharing, meant that people named risks they might not say out loud in a group first. This is what the method is designed to do, surface knowledge that exists in communities but never reaches the people designing or governing systems. How do we know this wasn't superficial? Well, there was a few markers. Cognitive exhaustion was one of them. After 2 intensive rounds, the participants were genuinely tired. We even changed the way the rest of the session was conducted to cater for that. The second one is we had a real involvement from the experts who stayed and continued engaging in and out of the room with the rest of the community. The third was that the question generated required knowledge that no technical team would normally have. The pathway we proposed here was that insights really needed somewhere to go. So we use community insight to feed real-time governance dialogue. The proof of that was first started in 2024 workshop, where the discussion on AI and family violence directly led to the first IEEE Industry Connection project on that issue. The pathway works because entry points exist before the positions solidify. The community insight reached the governance experts while recommendations on AI and family violence or youth tech addiction are still being shaped. Once either of those processes hardens, the same insight becomes feedback on someone else's decisions rather than contribution to shared ones. So the obvious question, does this scale? 30 to 40% participant is really intentional. The depth requires time for reflection, meaningful dialogue, genuine synthesis, and real accountability. So how do we scale? Not by adding participants, but by multiplication. Parallel workshops, training facilitators, embedding in existing governance processes, getting impact via standards instead of volume. It's better to have 30 people shaping IEEE standards, for example, than 300 giving superficial feedback. 6 principles, so if you wanted to adapt this, the first one is to engage before the policy hardens, so that the timing matters before the thinking is really fixed. Force perspective mixing, because it's been much better to let people not self-select and not stay in their comfort zone so that they can actually open up to other point of view and open conversation that didn't happen before. Preserve the individual voice. Don't skip the think phase, even though it can be uncomfortable for some people to be in silence for 5 or 6 or 8 minutes. Create accountability. The policymakers must respond. Then connect to institutional pathways, because we need the insight, we need them to have somewhere to go. And then accept that the depth trade-off means that there's a questions around scalability. To summarize our contribution, we present replicable methods for embedding community voice at the agenda setting stage, not after decisions are made. The evidence depth is achievable at workshop scale. Institutional pathways work, and communities report design agency, not just consultation. The evidence suggests that timing is not incidental to depth when communities engage before policy crystallizes. Policymakers and standards developers are still listening, not defending position already taken. Having extended voluntary participation from policymakers is itself evidence of that openness. So my question, what conditions would enable adapting this approach across different governance contexts? Thank you. My contact details are here, and I'd welcome any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie.
I'll try to stop sharing, sorry. Okay.
Great. If people can hold on to their questions until we finish all 4 presentations, so we can have some time for discussion at the end, because I know we'll be able to see some parallels across different jurisdictions and engagement processes. So we're now moving on to Asio Evelyn Patra, who is going to be presenting work done by Ugandan women in AI, looking at using AI at the community level and I'm not seeing.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Welcome. Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Evelyn Asio Patra, and I'm going to be presenting about how women in Uganda have views that can support governance, not just being users of AI. I will argue that Ugandan women are not merely users of AI. We are already acting as grassroots governors of AI, and we present a study that was done in 2025. I'm presenting on Uganda women in AI. Next slide, please. We've noticed that AI governance debates are mostly top-down or based on the global north, ignoring the south, and yet our dynamics are different. We are not similar in various ways. For example, in Uganda, only 28% have internet access. 28% population have internet access, and about 75% lack digital skills. It creates a situation of imbalance. So there is need for us to understand how is it possible in the global south. And despite the many barriers that are in Uganda and the global south, many women actually actively participate in engaging AI to make decisions in education, entrepreneurship, family, farming, agriculture, and everything, not as developers as such. The problem here is not lack of engagement. The problem is lack of representation in governance debates. Next slide. This slide shows you that 28% of Ugandans actually have access to internet, and the digital literacy gap is about 75% here. Next slide, please. The low internet penetration is a big deal, a very, very, very big deal. The Uganda Women in AI community is, we did a study in 2025, where we engaged about 500 women across diverse sectors. There were professional women, entrepreneurs, community leaders, and about 100 women from a circle, a group of people coming together to collect money and use it to benefit themselves. With little formal schooling, they had almost no education, but they were able to engage in this. There was diversity, and we were able to take them through to understand how AI can be used. We actually used the local language to guide them on how AI can be used to support them in their different areas. Can continue. It was a participatory workshop. We used the workshop model, and we considered the problem first model, where we asked them, how do you market your business? How do you actually determine when to plant your crops? How do you determine that now is the time for you to go to the hospital? Asking them different questions to understand what their main problem is. Then we introduced AI as a tool, and our design principles were mostly about accessibility and the local language. Like I said, we used the local language. There was a collection of stories, understanding how each of them was affected, and peer learning from each other. The structure enabled the women to become co-creators, not necessarily passive learners. Next slide. So we introduced them to AI as a tool for empowerment, and women using AI were in majorly three ways. Entrepreneurs generate AI design posters, just basic marketing material, learning how to communicate with other people in different languages, and educators were using it to voice text to come from voice to text tool to bridge the literacy gap in the places where they are educating the people. And mothers and health advocates use mobile chatbots to gain maternal information and maternal and child information, and use it to better their services. And these practices show adoption, not dependence, and women shaping how AI functions in the different contexts. And next slide. So the main risks that we identified here were that misinformation was what were concerns. What they were worried about? Misinformation and trust. They were concerned that, especially in business and in health, a lot of advice might be misleading, and there were privacy concerns, like when they upload sensitive information onto these tools, can it be accessed by other people? Then language barrier. Most anyway, the AI tools could not necessarily translate into our local language here. So it was a big deal for them. But the biggest fear they had was exclusion. Yeah. The fact that everything seems to be upend, not necessarily local. Next. So what did we use? What theoretical framework did we use? There was the Ostrom's principle, where we have the common pool resources, everything governed as a community, self-governance and responsibility for being self-driven to do the right thing at the right time and follow the right rules, and then collective effort to come together to solve a problem. And there was also the no-code governance, where there was innovation was pro-innovation and risk-based community-led ways of working together, rather than waiting for national legislation, communities creating micro policies here and there. Like there was fact-checking and intentional engagement with each other. So what framework did we come up with? This next. We mapped Uganda women in AI activities onto 5 governance steps: risk identification, rule co-creation, peer monitoring, graduated sanctions, and conflict resolution. This structured governance, without necessarily formal law, it's adapted an entire context integrated with this. So the workshop looked at different risks, risk identification, like I mentioned earlier, and then the role of co-creation, bringing in community norms, like in our local setting, working as a community is key. So there was need to check for each other. We would check on each other what they thought about what was going on. Let's go next. Yeah, so in conclusion, I'd like to say that the Uganda is a developing nation, and the AI policy is expected to extend to currently to end in 2025. So we need to argue that the formal policy must integrate grassroots insight, that deep has to be brought into the policy. Then we recognize the no-code governance as a legitimate complement to regulation. The most effective AI governance is co-created by communities that it serves. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you. And I look forward to questions that we shall be discussing later. A key point here is that in low resource contexts, governance gains in everyday conversations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's great to hear so much insight about adoption at the community level. And I'm really interested in speaking more about the role of women as users and as creators of knowledge and new practices. We're now moving on to Roshni Modhvadia from the Ada Lovelace Institute. And we're going to hold on to our questions for discussion.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. I'm Roshni. I'm a researcher from the Ada Lovelace Institute based in the UK. And as an institute, we conduct research on public expectations around AI. So today I'm going to be talking about both the challenges we have faced in doing this and innovations that we are enthusiastic about. But first, I want to start by describing why it's important to involve the public in decisions around AI. As we know, AI is not politically neutral, and its use has societal impacts on things like labor, access to key services, and so on. But we find that public voice is frequently missing from decision-making, particularly the voices that will be kind of most impacted by these tools. And this presentation focuses specifically on survey approaches, so quantitative approaches to involving the public. And this is because we recognize that these approaches occupy spaces of privilege. This type of evidence is often seen as objective, factual, and leveraged in policy conversations. And so there's a real responsibility to examine these methodologies quite carefully, being clear about what they can and cannot do, who they can and cannot represent, and reflective of how to use them going forward in relation to research on attitudes to AI. And in this talk, I will be guided by principles of quantitative criticalism to do this reflection. Briefly, quantitative criticalism draws from critical race theory scholarship, and it has kind of 5 key principles. The first is around the centrality of racism in society, even in the absence of statistical significance. It says that numbers are not neutral and therefore are not free from researcher positionality, and that the categories that we use to kind of define people are neither natural nor given. So the way that we define people in society is often grounded in histories that are contested. Quite importantly, that data cannot speak for itself and therefore needs careful interpretation and curation. And finally, that statistics do play a role in social justice struggles, kind of for the reason I mentioned previously. They are leveraged in societal debates and they do carry impact. And so these principles kind of speak to the way that quantitative data could further embed kind of existing power relations and inequities, but also ways of resisting this to mobilize change. So how do people feel about AI is a UK national survey of public attitudes. It's conducted by the Leda Lovelace Institute in partnership with the Alan Turing Institute. We've carried out 2 waves of this research, the first in 2023 and the most recent in 2025. And we do have funding secured for a 3rd wave in 2027. And the most recent wave was given the opportunity to think quite carefully about principles of diversity, equity, inclusion, specifically representation, which I'll be reflecting on as we go. So as we were doing this work, we reflected on the limitations of national surveys as a whole. By nature, they are set up to poorly represent people from minority groups. And a clear example of this was in the first iteration of our survey, which had a sample of over 4,000 people. And they were recruited to be broadly representative of the Great British public. This sample was then split in half so that we could increase the number of different applications of AI we could ask about. And while 2,000 people seems kind of large in principle, it isn't statistically. And so, for instance, by recognizing the centrality of racism in society, we wanted to explore differences in attitudes towards specific use of AI by race. And that we found that we were only left with a sample of only 50 Black British participants to do this for most use cases, which is not kind of strong enough to do any kind of meaningful statistical comparisons. And so for context, to reliably detect kind of median-sized differences between groups, you need at least 64 people in that group. And this goes up to 394 if the differences you're looking for between groups is more subtle. So as I said, this left us with a tension. Nationally representative surveys by design poorly represent small groups. And so for our second iteration, we decided to use sample boosting as a way of improving this representation. So this is when you choose kind of certain groups to deliberately oversample based on. And it's a technique often used in kind of UK large-scale household studies, but it isn't something that's translated as commonly into research in the AI space. And based on our understanding of the literature and who tends to be kind of most impacted by a range of AI use cases, we chose to oversample based on ethnicity, income levels, and digital confidence. And we found that the ecosystem of probability samples just wasn't well set up for this. So probability sampling is often seen as kind of the gold standard of survey design. Participants are kind of randomly offered the opportunity to sign up to take part in this research. And that means in theory that everybody kind of has an equal chance of being represented. But we found that even the strongest providers in the UK for these types of panels acknowledged that they had representation issues. So coming back again, for instance, Black British participants tended to be poorly represented here as well. There are also a limited number of groups that you can oversample on before budget runs thin, so a real practical kind of constraint there. And even when you do have categories to oversample on, these run the risk of being quite arbitrary or overly simplistic. So for instance, we had to condense kind of all Asian participants into an Asian subgroup, even though we know that the experiences of Bangladeshi people in the UK differs quite a bit from the experiences of Indian people, Chinese people, Pakistani people, and so on. And so while this was an opportunity to think more critically about quantitative data, without taking these limitations kind of into account, we risk furthering the idea that data can speak for itself, when in fact we can see here that there were many researcher decisions and wider kind of systemic factors that affected the type of data we could collect in the first place. Quant crit principles were also important for us to consider in terms of how we communicated our findings. So we intentionally compared attitudes from subgroups against the general population, rather than a reference category like white, high income, digitally literate. And this was to decenter the experiences of often culturally privileged groups as a baseline. So for instance, we found that among those with fewer digital skills, 41% felt LLMs could be beneficial compared to 63% of the general population, rather than comparing against those that had higher levels of digital skills. But even so, we found ourselves in a position where many of our headline findings focused mostly on majority views, as these tend to be the most compelling and easy to interpret. So, for instance, that there is majority support for independent regulation, a majority concern around over-reliance on technology. And we were only able to look at kind of identity markers in isolation rather than in combination. So you're focusing on one specific aspect or kind of one specific aspect, for instance, income level, as opposed to the intersection of that trait with other demographic features. So building from these learnings, I'm going to close by discussing some opportunities we now have for the third iteration of this work. Multi-level analysis of individual heterogeneity and discriminatory accuracy, besides being a mouthful, is an analytic innovation that allows us to robustly apply an intersectional framework to kind of quantitative analysis in ways that traditional methods fall short. So in particular, it can deal with issues of small sample sizes quite well, which we've seen kind of from the ecosystem is a limitation of conducting nationally representative work and using probability sampling. It draws from critical race theory, which we know has informed kind of quant crit. So the two things fit together quite well. And it's typically been used in the context of health and education. But I kind of propose that this approach is also useful for attitudinal research, as societal inequalities does impact our kind of perceptions and feelings as well. So coming back to our recent survey, one of the uses of AI we focused on was facial recognition in policing. Data on this application has been difficult for us to pass together, as on the one hand, our qualitative evidence really highlights high levels of concern around this tool, whilst on the other hand, our quantitative evidence paints a slightly more optimistic picture, with many people seeing this tool as beneficial and only a few, it's around 2 in 5, being concerned. And in the most recent wave of our work, at face value, we did see some indication of inequalities and experiences, which we were able to surface through that sample boosting. So for instance, people from minoritized ethnic groups were more concerned than white British participants, men were more concerned than women, and young people were more concerned than older people, as well as people overall on lower incomes being more concerned than people on higher incomes. But to dig into this data further, we've more recently looked at the effect of the following attributes in combination with one another on attitudes. So looking at the combination of gender, age, ethnicity, income, and digital confidence, which together make 150 different possible combinations of identity markers, which is again another benefit of this analytical approach in that it can handle this level of complexity. We found that in doing so, 9% of variation of whether or not somebody is concerned by facial recognition in policing is attributable to the effects of the combination, so the intersection of these identity markers, rather than the individual contribution of each characteristic. And just to briefly kind of map this, to demonstrate this complexity here, you can see the predicted percentage of people that are concerned by facial recognition in policing in each of the different kind of identity marker combination groups. And we find that historically privileged groups have lower levels of concern around this technology than others. So those are the kind of points marked in red and at the lower end of the graph. And looking through the lens of intersectionality, we find that combining these attributes is important. So Black men and women under the age of 35 are those that are most concerned by facial recognition in policing, irrespective of income level, whilst women with their ethnicity reported as other, with fewer digital skills, were least concerned. So we see here how the technology may relate to systems of oppression that over-surveil some communities over others. And so to sum up, we've learned in doing this research that there are inequalities in how people experience AI tools, but headline figures, though compelling, can often obscure many of these inequalities. We suggest that Quant Crit offers principles that, when applied, can help us better represent the experience of diverse publics in debates on AI. And working through the challenges of doing this in practice at funding, researcher, and policy levels will only improve the quality of evidence that we have and the quality of recommendations we can make for change as well. And so while there's an argument that we may kind of need more data, more coverage, etc., I feel here we can see that by applying these principles, we can see how sometimes it's the case that we need more careful coverage and more nuanced presentations of the data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roshni. We're moving straight to the final presentation, and then we can a discussion. So I'm very happy to welcome Arne Hintz from Cardiff University.
Hello, everyone. I'm just make sure this is. I hope you can see the
Yes, thank you.
the presentation. Fantastic. Thanks. Good morning. Well, or almost good afternoon. Good afternoon for others here. Yes, my name is Arne Hintz. I'm joining from Cardiff in Wales in the UK, where we run a little research center we call the Data Justice Lab, and that's exploring the datafication of society and the implication of this for social justice. Here you see actually some of the four directors of the lab, or well, what we looked like some years ago. Quite a few years ago. And at that point, we were all faculty members at Cardiff, but in the meantime, the others have moved on to other universities and other countries, and we continue the lab as a kind of a virtual space across our various institutions. We define data justice roughly like this, as in one of our publications, an analysis of data that pays particular attention to structural inequality, highlighting the unevenness of implications and experiences of data across different groups and communities in society. And of course, this aligns very well with what we've just heard from Roshni, but also from others here in this session, and also probably during this day. And at the lab, we try to contribute to this debate, for example, through research projects. And here I just listed a few of them that were maybe of particular relevance for what we're discussing here. Also some publications, such as the two books that you see here on the left column, and some non-academic reports, toolkits, and guidebooks that are targeted at other communities and stakeholders, such as those that you see here in the right column. We've organized 3 data justice conferences in the past, and the next one will take place this year in Cardiff, again, the 1st and 2nd of June, under the title The Data Fight State. So if any of you happen to be in the area around that time, please come and join us for this. We've been interested in many different issues around datafication and AI use, such as, of course, biases and inequalities and how people are assessed through data, and the harms that emerge from this, but also questions of accountability and transparency. And we've mainly been interested in how data and AI are deployed in government to inform and allocate public services such as welfare or policing or other areas. And well, the situation in the UK is probably similar to the one in many other places. The government has declared that it wants to roll out AI massively across government and society to, as they say here, ramp up AI adoption, or to turbocharge AI. And then all this leads, of course, to the questions that many of us here today are concerned with. How do we participate as citizens and residents in decisions on how data systems and AI are developed, but also deployed and applied? And specifically, and that's, as I said, specifically our interest. How do we intervene in the deployment in government and in the public sector where state-citizen relations are affected most severely, perhaps, and particularly also on the local level where such decisions have very immediate effects? What are the perspectives also of local government on this, which is what I'm particularly talking about here today. And more broadly, of course, how do we advance civic agency and democracy in the governance then of data and AI? Like others here today, I've been very interested in the concept and practice of democratic innovations, models of participation and deliberation that allow us to address the broader societal debate about data and AI, not kind of just the design, not just kind of specific mechanisms of governance, but really kind of the broader questions of the use of AI, but also how it should be, how decision making should happen about it, and to influence this governmental policy and decision making. So these are typically initiatives that bring together a small selection of the population for deliberation on key issues that a society is facing, sometimes randomly selected, sometimes recruited to represent the diversity of a population. And in the end, they make then proposals or decisions on the issue they have discussed. Many publics and similar methods have been used quite successfully, for example, for local and city development, or for the amendment and new development of constitutions, like in Iceland here in this picture. In the UK, where I live and work, these methods have also been used for questions of data and AI. Here on the left, I list just a few examples from recent years. There have been many, many more such cases and events and initiatives. At the bottom right, you see a picture of one of the citizen juries on the use of AI in health and other areas in Manchester a few years ago. On the top right, there's a picture from the Ada Lovelace Institute Citizen Councils on the use of biometrics and facial recognition. Some of these events have been commissioned by major government-related institutions, some by think tanks, some also by civil, some also by have commissioned and being run by civil society organizations. But if we look at the local level, there has been perhaps a little less of that, especially if we look at initiatives run by local councils. One interesting example is the Camden Data Charter. So the London Borough of Camden, part of the City of London in the UK, they held rounds of 3-day resident panels, which invited Camden residents to comment on data use, and residents were chosen to be demographically representative of the borough. Based on these panels, Camden created a data charter to guide its uses of data, and it committed itself also to an annual program of Camden Talks across the borough around data use to keep residents involved in how the council uses data. Another example, not directly by, but connected with local government, are the community data conversations organized by the Liverpool Data Cooperative. They trained and prepared community groups in several towns across the region to co-host conversations on how data should be used locally. And another project, they also recruited and trained community researchers to carry out interviews in their own communities. And they also created a residents' assembly to create a community charter also on data and AI. And several of these initiatives use methods of distributed dialogues to foreground their distributed and place-based nature. And now we ran several projects to better understand these kinds of practices. We also conducted initiatives to help decision makers at local councils, explore the challenges and best practices of these, to provide spaces of learning and exchange about democratic innovations at local level. One of these was a series of action learning sets, workshops, basically a series of workshops with local government officers in England and Wales over the course of several months. And another was a one-day engagement lab event last summer that was organized together with our friends from Connected by Data and also from the Liverpool Civic Data Co-op, where local council members and experts from think tanks, academia, and civil society could exchange experiences. Now, in these conversations, some of the key challenges have emerged that affect the wider implementation of democratic innovations at the local level. And I just want to point to a few here. Of course, there is great unevenness in how much people at local councils actually know about models of participation and deliberation and how to implement those. The action learning set workshops were actually very, very open events where they started to talk without much guidance, and it emerged pretty quickly that some participants knew a lot about this and others hadn't heard about it at all. So great unevenness here. Of course, then, if we talk about local government in the UK and I guess elsewhere too, the lack of resources is a key stumbling block. Times when public services and local government have less and less funding, and of course, organizing citizen juries and citizen assemblies and so on is expensive. A problem that came up repeatedly is the lack of support and buy-in by council leaders and others in the institution. So if you are an officer or somebody working in a local council, you are interested in creating public involvement, citizen engagement, how do you convince others in the institution that this is worth doing, and also that it should be about genuine citizen participation? That is an issue that repeatedly came up. Another institutional factor is also that debates and decisions about AI deployment are often hosted and led by technical departments in governments and local councils. It's supposedly some kind of a technical issue on technological applications. And the fact that this is really about the fundamental nature of state-citizen relations and democracy often gets lost thereby. And then we can add to all this, of course, some of the broader challenges of democratic innovations and public involvement. And we heard about this already. This ties in really with what others have said. The question of representation, of course, the model of mini publics, also just similar maybe to other methods that we heard about. It is about representing the average citizen, but the impacts of datafication and AI are very uneven and often affect marginalized communities much more than average citizens. And so, yeah, there have been some attempts actually to deal with this. Organizations like the Liverpool Civic Data Co-op or also the Ada Lovelace Institute have experimented with different models and approaches to expand a little bit this practice. Democratic innovations are often top-down, commissioned and organized by large institutions, and they need to engage more with the initiatives at the grassroots and inside communities themselves. And again, in this session, we heard already a lot about this. And further and also connected, I guess, the initiatives that are then implemented are typically pilots and one-off examples. But it's been difficult so far to institutionalize them as a continuous part of the council's and the government's regular practice. We don't have any immediate solutions for these, but just one thing that maybe one overarching thing that members of local councils and local government told us was that actually these kinds of spaces of exchange and learning that we try to also advance were helpful for them to understand both best practices and challenges. And they have lots of meetings already, but typically they're guided by specific agendas, like a government mandate to expand AI use or corporate efforts to sell products. And they need spaces for open exchange and reflection with others in their situation. And so we'll continue to observe this and see what we can do to help these reflections. But for now, thanks very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the debate.
Thank you so much, Arne. So we've now come to the end of the presentations. I'm hoping we can get all 4 speakers if they're available, so we can take some questions. I know we had a comment from Tim earlier on regarding the work of Ugandan women in AI as micro-governance. I know Evelyn herself described it, I believe, as self-governance instead. Would you say there's a distinction, Evelyn?
A distinction between digital literacy and governance?
Would you describe your work with women using AI as self-governance?
Oh, that's an important question. I would think that
I think we might be having some connection issues here.
coming together, and yet that is the
I think we've lost Evelyn.
sorry about that. I think my connection just dropped. Sorry about that.
Yes, we're
Yeah,
back.
so I was saying that it's just women understanding how to use it, then realizing that we need to change our behavior towards this so that it can be valuable for us. It's not necessarily self-governance, just contributing towards the welfare of other people who might use AI in wrong ways, maybe, preventing some things to happen, go wrong here and there. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Yes, I think there's an important point there in terms of harnessing the expertise of members in the community. And I know Stephanie touched on that as well, in terms of the tensions between members of the public having to work with policymakers or students, perhaps with experienced professionals, and kind of designing a process that allows insights from all those people to be placed on equal footing. Stephanie, could you speak a bit about that?
Yes, it's I was very interested by all of the different interventions today, because and it's something, just to answer your question, but at the same time reflecting on what I've heard. In many ways, all of the work that I've been doing lately uses a different type of approach to representation. I often use. There's some noises coming from somewhere else. Often use a power matrix. So it's about very specific applications of AI. In this case, when we're talking about AI and family violence, we were actually working very specifically with how the police was looking at case management and detection and et cetera, using AI. So we used the power matrix looking at migrant communities, and of course women and people speaking different languages, and that's the people who have the less power on the design of an AI solution, but at the same time are the most impacted. And therefore, when we looked at representation and getting voices around the table to discuss that problem, of course, we talked to the police, etc. But from a community perspective, it was about having those voices directly in the room so that they can influence the policy conversation, and highlight the type of problems that they saw, so that they come on the agenda of the policymakers or the standards developers. So yeah, I don't know if I answered exactly your question. Sorry, I went a little bit aside, but that's what came to mind when we're talking about representation here.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes, it seems definitely that policing is a big concern, as both Roshni and Arne have mentioned. We do have a question from Renee for Arne, which I want to move on to next, which is what is meant by genuine participation, which I think is relevant for everyone.
Yeah, that was a kind of kind of a term that I just put in there in terms of an explanation of one of the points that I raised. Now we would need to deconstruct that a little bit more, but I think others have also in this session referred to different, and in previous sessions actually referred to different types of possible different types of participation. And there are models, of course, like Arnstein's ladder, and there are Pateman's different types of participation and so on. But yeah, I think what I was referring to there also with regards to debates within local councils and within local government is, yeah, to what extent citizens and residents then should have the power to affect decisions and outcomes. And of course, the types of models that I was talking about, they are typically deliberative. They are not primarily about co-decision making. They're not transferring power to citizens and to residents as such. And then the question is always, to what extent do they influence the decision making or also thinking in policy and in government? I mean, Stephanie, you referred also to the importance of to not just the importance of affecting actual final decision making, but also the much earlier stages of affecting debates about AI and our thinking about AI, and also the thinking of policymakers. So I guess what I refer to, or what people are struggling with then also in local government, those that we talked about was yeah, this tension in a way between the kind of sometimes the need to engage the public and with the risk of what has been called engagement washing and participation washing and so on, and on the other side the wish by some to involve to enhance the power and the decision making possibilities and the influence of publics. Yeah, maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Great, thank you. Yes, lots to think about there. I did have another question for Roshni, just in terms of clarifying the kind of input we're seeking from people and kind of how we categorize them. Could you talk a bit about your the, I guess, tag of digitally confident versus not digitally confident? Is that defined as a binary or kind of a spectrum? If you could speak a bit about that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And defining that was something that was a bit of a challenge throughout the research. And so we ended up kind of thinking about some proxy measures, which were kind of amalgamated to create ultimately, I guess, a binary of digital confidence versus not confidence, which included things like confidence in doing certain tasks online, which we've taken from standardized measures, But in terms as well at kind of a higher level in how we initially kind of oversampled, we also looked at in terms of whether people had generally opted to complete the previous surveys online versus over the phone as a potential kind of proxy of digital confidence. And so, yeah, things like that, whether, people self-reported kind of digital engagement, how much they use specific tools to get information, which was definitely an imperfect measure. And I think it comes back to sometimes these categories that we create can be quite arbitrary. But I think it was a good learning process for us as well, in that we kind of had this idea of digital inclusion, digital confidence as being important, something to capture. But then it really pushed us to think about, well, how do you do this well? Especially from like a quantitative point. And a similar thing kind of came up for us as well when we were looking at kind of low income, high income, and how do we define that? Do we take kind of standardized measures of household income? Do we look at self-reported kind of levels of people feeling financially comfortable? Or do we take something else into account? And all of these decisions kind of sit underneath the data, and I don't think necessarily are so easy to communicate when we're doing survey work like this. So I think, yeah, it's important to draw attention to that.
Great, thank you. If I could just, as we're coming up to the end, take this back to Evelyn's work and thinking about barriers to digital engagement and adoption of AI. Could you talk a bit about the barriers that you've mentioned in the context that you're working on to digital engagement, which I understand are not just confined to AI, but just in terms of general digital skills and ability to use technologies day to day?
Thank you for that question. In Uganda, we have about maybe close to 40 million people. Yeah, 36 to 40 million people. And many of them are illiterate digitally. So, when it comes to using AI, you need to be able to use a computer. You need to be able to maneuver it. And most of our internet adoption is mobile-based. And many of them still don't know how to maneuver the phone, apart from making a phone call, sending a text message, or just collecting money. That's mostly what it's used for. And another issue might be the people who are able to afford internet are very few people. So the internet penetration is low. Like I showed you, it's 28% of the entire population. This means that people will not get to interact with AI. They don't have access to the internet. So what Uganda Women in AI is trying to do is just bring these people up to speed to understand them and then provide low-cost ways of accessing the internet and learning how to use these gadgets for their good. That's why we start with what problem are you facing? And then we bring in AI as a tool. And then we say, for this to happen, you need this. Let's teach you how to maneuver this. Then we can have low-cost internet like this, shared, and the community, the commons idea of sharing whatever we have. And we are here to support you. We provide a safe space for them to be confident. So this is just basically it. The infrastructure is an issue. The digital literacy is an issue. And generally, we're just starting to have an AI policy. It's just coming recently. It's becoming a big deal now. We never had one before. So it's the right time for us to now bring out what should be included in that policy and to encourage the fact that much as you set up the policy, it is implemented at the grassroots. So the people at the grassroots are the ones going to form behavior out of this policy anyway. We need to understand what's happening there. Yeah, so that are the main three. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is such a fantastic example of bringing adoption from the ground up. So thank you. And a final question we can just squeeze in is, how do we ensure participatory AI processes are actually redistributing decision-making power rather than just being consultative in nature? I think Stephanie, in terms of her work, has been looking at that. I don't know if you'd like to take this one very quickly.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because the step between consultation to decision making is a very big one, very big one. When you're working with companies and you're trying to get participation about I don't know, an AI product that they want to put on the market, but they want to do the right thing and try to get people that are going to be affected to get their voice. Often you need to have something that forces them to do that, maybe some ESG governance framework or some reporting governance about their Modern Slavery Act, for example, in Australia is something that forces you to disclose the supply chain of your products, and therefore when you're trying to make decisions about AI, you need to demonstrate in real terms how you have been making decisions about something that is going to affect your population or your clients. In the standards world, it's a little bit easier because it's all voluntary and therefore it's charity based. So when we start conversations, people stay involved with the subject matter that they're really passionate about, and therefore they really have an opportunity to influence the decision making and the standards themselves all the way to the end. So that's quite special. From a government perspective, it depends. It depends on the size of governments, the level of governments, the type of projects you're working on. If you have some local governments that have decided to involve their their residents, for example, into how to use AI in urban planning, then you have a certain level of the decision making that you can see making progress throughout. But a lot of the time, it's more of a feedback on is that user interface right or not, type of thing. So it really depends on context.
Thank you so much. We've come up to the end of our time. I think we were able to answer every question in the chat. Thank you so much to our presenters for their work. It was great to hear, especially the parallels between the different kind of ways of working and the importance of empathy and foregrounding specific perspectives by design. Thank you. There's some round of applause.